The real reason. You can't stop replaying conversations in your head. You know replaying it changes nothing. That's the part that makes no sense. You were there. You heard what was said, you said what you said, and the conversation ended. It's done. No amount of mental rehearsal will go back and alter a single word that was spoken, a single tone that landed wrong, a single moment that felt like something important slipped away before you could catch it. And yet your mind returns to it, again and again and again, with the same focus, the same emotional charge, the same urgent need to find something it keeps missing. That's not overthinking. Not exactly. Overthinking is what people call it when they want to make the pattern sound manageable, when they want to believe it's just a bad habit, something that can be interrupted with the right technique, the right distraction, the right amount of discipline. But if that were true, you would have stopped by now. Because you've tried. You've told yourself to let it go. You've replayed the conversation one final time, promised yourself it was the last time, and then found yourself replaying it again 3 hours later with even more precision than before. Something else is happening here. The mind does not obsessively return to things without reason. Every psychological loop has a function, something it is trying to resolve, protect, or prove. And the conversations that stay with you the longest are never really about the words that were exchanged. They are about something much older than the conversation itself, something that was already unresolved long before that specific exchange took place. The conversation simply touched it, activated it, gave it a face and a moment and a specific sentence to attach itself to. You've been doing this for years, across dozens of conversations, with different people in different contexts, about different things. And the one constant has never been the other person. It has always been you, and the particular kind of pain that certain exchanges leave behind. A pain that doesn't quite fit the word hurt, that doesn't dissolve with time the way normal disappointment does, that seems to carry a weight disproportionate to what actually happened. That disproportionate weight is the clue, because in psychology, when a reaction is larger than its apparent cause, it almost always means the cause is not what it appears to be. The conversation you keep replaying is not the source of the feeling. It is the trigger. And understanding the difference between a source and a trigger is the first step toward understanding why your mind works the way it does, and why no amount of willpower, distraction, or self-analysis has ever been able to make it stop. This video is not going to tell you to breathe through it. It is not going to offer you 5 steps to break the cycle. What it is going to do is take you somewhere most conversations about overthinking never go, into the hidden psychological architecture beneath the loop, into what the replaying is actually doing for you, into why a part of you needs it, and what that need reveals about the emotional patterns you've been carrying, probably for most of your life, without ever fully seeing them for what they are. The loop is not the problem. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from thinking too much about the same thing. It doesn't feel like fatigue at first. It feels like unfinished business, like a file your mind refuses to close because something inside it has not yet been resolved. You tell yourself, you just need to understand what happened. You tell yourself that once you find the right explanation, the right interpretation, the right framing for why that conversation went the way it did, the loop will finally stop. But it never does, because understanding was never actually what the loop was looking for. That's the first thing most people get wrong about mental replaying. They treat it as a cognitive problem, a thought that won't stop, a mental habit that needs to be interrupted, a pattern of rumination that needs to be managed. And so they try to think their way out of it. They analyze the conversation more carefully. They reconstruct the timeline. They assign motives to the other person, then reassign them, then question the reassignment. They look for the logical explanation that will finally make the loop feel unnecessary. And every time, the loop absorbs the analysis and continues. Because the loop was never asking for logic. It was asking for something else entirely. In psychological terms, what drives repetitive mental replay is not confusion about the external event. It is unresolved internal tension, a feeling that was activated by the conversation but existed long before it. The conversation gave that feeling a specific shape, a specific voice, a specific moment to attach itself to. But the feeling itself is older. It has a history inside you that stretches back further than that exchange, further than that relationship, further than you can probably trace with conscious memory. And the loop keeps returning to the conversation not because it needs more information about what happened, but because it is trying to metabolize something it doesn't yet know how to process. The loop is not the problem. The loop is the symptom, and symptoms in psychology are always pointing somewhere. They are the mind's way of signaling that something beneath the surface needs attention. The question is not how to stop the loop. The question is what the loop is pointing to, what it keeps circling around, what it keeps almost touching but never quite reaching, what it would find if it could go deeper than the words that were said and arrive at the emotional truth underneath them. That is where this video is going. Not toward the conversation, toward what the conversation activated. Because until you understand what lies beneath the loop, every attempt to stop it will feel exactly like every other attempt before it, temporarily effective and ultimately insufficient. Something inside you already knows this. That's why you're still here. The feeling, beneath the feeling. Most people who replay conversations are not primarily thinking about what the other person said. They are thinking about how it made them feel. And more specifically, they are thinking about a particular layer of that feeling that they cannot fully name. There is the surface feeling: irritation, embarrassment, sadness, confusion. That part is recognizable, that part has a word. But beneath it there is something else. Something that doesn't quite fit any of the standard emotional vocabulary. Something that feels uncomfortably familiar in a way that has nothing to do with the person you were speaking to. That's the feeling beneath the feeling. It's the one the loop is actually trying to reach, and it's the one that makes the replay feel so urgent, so necessary, so impossible to simply decide to stop. Because on some level, your nervous system knows that what got activated in that conversation was not just a reaction to that conversation. It was a recognition, a moment where something that lives deep inside your emotional history was suddenly, briefly visible, and then just as quickly, covered back up by the noise of the exchange itself. Psychologists sometimes call this an emotional echo. The present event carries a frequency that resonates with something from the past, not necessarily a memory you can name, not necessarily a specific event you can point to, but a pattern, a familiar shape of feeling, the specific quality of not being understood, the specific texture of saying something true about yourself and watching it land wrong, the specific sensation of a moment where connection was possible and then suddenly wasn't. These are not random sensations. They have a history inside you. And when a conversation triggers them, the loop begins not because of what happened, but because of what it reminded your nervous system of. This is why the replay is rarely proportionate to the event. The conversation might have been relatively minor, a misread message, a tone that felt dismissive, a moment of silence that felt like rejection. But the feeling it left behind is enormous, dense, carrying a weight that doesn't match the scale of what actually occurred. That disproportionate weight is the emotional echo at work. The present event was small, but the pattern it activated is old and large and has been accumulating in your nervous system for a long time without a proper outlet. The loop keeps returning because the echo hasn't finished resonating, and the echo won't finish resonating by replaying the surface of the conversation. It will only begin to quiet when you go deep enough to recognize what it is actually responding to, not in that conversation but in the larger pattern of your emotional history. What specific quality of feeling does this conversation share with the ones that have stayed with you before? What is the thread that runs through all the exchanges your mind refuses to release? The answer to that question is not about other people. It has always been about you, and about something in your emotional architecture that has been waiting, across many years and many conversations, to finally be seen clearly. Why your nervous system keeps the score. There is a part of your brain that does not experience time the way your conscious mind does. Your conscious mind knows that the conversation happened in the past. It knows that it's over, that the other person has likely moved on, that dwelling on it serves no practical purpose. Your conscious mind can recite all of this clearly and still be completely unable to stop the replay, because the part of you that keeps running the loop is not your conscious mind. It is your nervous system. And your nervous system does not organize experience by date. It organizes experience by threat level, by emotional significance, by whether a situation was ever fully resolved, or whether it was left open, suspended in a kind of internal amber, preserved at exactly the emotional temperature it had when it first occurred. The conversations that get replayed are the ones your nervous system flagged as unresolved. Not intellectually unresolved. Emotionally unresolved. There is a difference, and the difference matters enormously. Intellectual resolution is when you understand what happened. Emotional resolution is when your nervous system no longer experiences the memory as an active threat. You can understand a situation completely. You can analyze it, contextualize it, forgive it, explain it to others with perfect clarity, and still feel a tightness in your chest when it surfaces again. That tightness is your nervous system telling you that understanding was not enough, that something in the experience is still open, still waiting. This is not a flaw in your psychology. It is a feature. The nervous system's ability to hold emotional experiences open, to keep them accessible, to keep them charged, is a survival mechanism. It exists to ensure that experiences which carry meaningful emotional information are not discarded before they've been fully processed. The problem is that the processing your nervous system is waiting for rarely happens through replaying. Replaying keeps the experience active, but it doesn't complete it. It circles the wound without ever quite entering it. And so the loop continues, not because your nervous system is malfunctioning, but because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do, holding the door open until the real processing can begin. The real processing requires something different than analysis. It requires being able to sit with the feeling itself, not the story about the feeling, not the reconstruction of the conversation, not the counter-arguments you wished you'd made, but the raw, wordless sensation underneath all of it. The part that feels like exposure, the part that feels like not being enough, the part that feels like the specific loneliness of being in a room with another person and still feeling completely alone. That is what your nervous system is holding. That is what the loop keeps trying to reach. And until you can face it directly, without immediately covering it with more analysis, the loop will keep the door open, because it knows you haven't arrived there yet. The identity wound behind the words. Not every conversation gets replayed, only specific ones. And if you trace the ones that stay with you, the ones your mind returns to weeks later, the ones that surface at 3 a.m. without warning, you will find that they share a particular quality. They are not simply the conversations where you were hurt. They are the conversations where you felt fundamentally misread, where something true about who you are was seen incorrectly, dismissed, flattened into something it wasn't, or simply not seen at all. That's the real wound. Not what was said, but what wasn't recognized. There is a psychological distinction between being hurt and feeling unseen. Being hurt can heal through time, through conversation, through repair. Feeling unseen doesn't heal the same way, because it doesn't register as damage to a relationship. It registers as damage to something inside you, to your sense of being knowable, being legible, being someone whose inner reality can actually be understood by another person. And when that gets activated, the replay doesn't just replay the conversation, it replays the injury to your sense of self. This is what makes the loop so persistent, because you are not just trying to resolve what happened between you and another person. You are trying to resolve a question about yourself, a question that conversations seem to raise, or confirm, or deepen. The question usually doesn't announce itself clearly. It hides inside the replay disguised as a practical concern about what you should have said or done differently. But underneath the tactical analysis, the question is almost always existential. Am I too much? Am I too sensitive? Was I wrong about who I thought I was in that moment? Does the way they responded mean something true about how I am perceived? And if so, what does that mean about whether I am truly known by anyone at all? These are not questions about a conversation. They are questions about identity. And identity questions cannot be answered by replaying surface-level exchanges. They can only be addressed by going to the place where the question was first formed, to the experiences, usually much earlier in your life, where you first learned that being fully yourself in the presence of another person carried a specific kind of risk, where you first discovered that certain parts of you were too complicated, too intense, too difficult to contain within a normal social exchange, where you first started editing yourself in order to be understood, and then felt the quiet grief of being understood only as the edited version. The conversations you replay are the ones that touch that grief. They reopen the question you've been carrying since long before you had the language for it. And the loop will keep returning to them until something more fundamental shifts. Not your interpretation of what was said, but your relationship with the part of yourself that is still waiting to be seen, without having to make itself smaller first. The exhaustion of being a person who feels too precisely. There is a particular kind of person who replays conversations more intensely than others. You can recognize them not by how emotional they are. They are often the least visibly emotional people in a room, but by how precisely they feel. They don't just feel sad. They feel the specific texture of a sadness that has a history. They don't just feel misunderstood. They feel the exact contour of the gap between who they know themselves to be and how they were just perceived. They register emotional information the way a precision instrument registers vibration, picking up frequencies that most people around them don't even notice are present. This is not a sensitivity problem. It is a calibration difference, and it comes at a cost that is almost impossible to explain to someone who doesn't share it. The cost is not just the replaying itself, though that is exhausting enough. The cost is the relentless quality of living inside a nervous system that is always processing, always scanning, always interpreting, always trying to make meaning out of microsignals that most people's systems simply filter out. A slight shift in someone's tone, a pause that lasted a half-second too long, a word choice that didn't quite match the warmth that was supposedly being expressed. Your system catches all of it, files all of it, flags all of it for later review, and by the time the conversation is over, you are carrying a weight the other person doesn't even know they handed you. This is one of the most isolating aspects of being someone who processes emotional experience at this depth, because you cannot easily explain it without sounding like you are accusing the other person of something they didn't consciously do. You cannot say, "I noticed that your voice changed at exactly this point," without sounding paranoid. You cannot say the way you phrased that told me something you probably didn't intend to reveal, without sounding like you are performing a kind of emotional surveillance. And so you stay quiet about it. You process it internally. You run the loop. You try to figure out alone what was actually communicated beneath the surface of what was said. That aloneness is part of the exhaustion. Because you are doing an enormous amount of emotional labor in private that the other person in the conversation is not doing at all. They have moved on. They are not replaying. Whatever was exchanged for them has already been metabolized and released, the way normal emotional processing works for people whose systems are calibrated differently. And you are still there, in the loop, holding an invisible weight that you can't put down and can't fully explain, feeling the quiet impossibility of bridging the gap between the depth at which you experience things and the depth at which most of the world is willing to meet you. The replay in this light is not just rumination. It is the attempt of a precise and deeply feeling mind to find, in memory, the connection and clarity that the actual conversation couldn't quite provide. It is the search for a moment of real contact, a moment where you were fully seen, fully understood, received without editing or reduction. And the reason the loop keeps running is not because you are obsessive. It is because that moment of real contact is the one thing the replay can simulate but never actually deliver. What you were really hoping the conversation would do. Every conversation that gets replayed was carrying a hope. Not always a conscious one. Not always one you could have named before the conversation started, but a hope nonetheless, something you were, on some level, expecting or wanting the exchange to provide. And the replay almost always begins at the exact moment that hope went unmet. This is worth sitting with. Because most people, when they examine what they were hoping for, discover that the hope was not simply about the content of the conversation. It wasn't just about being agreed with or understood on a practical level, or having a conflict resolved. The hope was something older and deeper than that. It was the hope of being received, of bringing a real part of yourself into contact with another person and having that part handled with care, recognized, held without being reduced, met without having to explain yourself into exhaustion first. That hope is not naive. It is one of the most fundamental human needs. But for people who process experience at significant depth, it is also one of the most frequently disappointed. Because the emotional vocabulary required to meet you where you actually live is a rare thing. Most people communicate on the surface of feeling. They exchange pleasantries about emotional states. They offer standard reassurances. They respond to the content of what you said, rather than the emotional architecture behind it. And when you are someone for whom the architecture is the point, the surface exchange can feel like a conversation that happened entirely in the wrong language. The replay begins when you feel that translation failure. When something you said, something that felt precise and true and carefully chosen, landed differently than it was meant. When the response you received addressed the words but missed what the words were trying to carry. When you walked away from the exchange feeling simultaneously exposed and unmet, as if you had opened a door and the other person had looked past it without realizing there was anything on the other side. And so you go back. In your mind, you rewrite the conversation. You say it differently this time, more clearly, more carefully, in a way that cannot be misread. You imagine the response that would have actually landed, the moment of recognition that didn't happen, the connection that felt so close and then quietly dissolved. You are not replaying the conversation that occurred. You are rehearsing the conversation you needed, over and over, because some part of you is still waiting for it to happen. That is perhaps the most tender thing about the loop. It is not just a symptom of anxiety or rumination. It is evidence of how deeply you still want to be known, how much you still believe, despite the history of disappointed hopes, that real contact between people is possible, that there exists somewhere a conversation where you don't have to shrink, or clarify, or apologize for the depth at which you feel. The loop keeps running because the hope hasn't died. It has just been deferred again and again into the next conversation, and the one after that, and the one you're still replaying now. The role of shame in keeping the loop alive. There is one emotion that the replay almost always carries but rarely announces directly. It moves beneath the analysis, beneath the reconstructed dialogue, beneath the intellectual effort to understand what went wrong. It doesn't always feel like itself. Sometimes it feels like anger. Sometimes it feels like a vague sense of wrongness, a discomfort that has no precise address. Sometimes it masquerades as the urgent need to explain yourself more clearly, to go back and correct the record, to ensure that the other person understands that you are not who the conversation made you seem. That emotion is shame, not necessarily the dramatic face-burning kind, the quieter kind, the kind that whispers that you revealed too much or not enough, or the wrong thing at the wrong moment. The kind that suggests that a more composed, more articulate, more emotionally regulated version of you would have handled that conversation better. The kind that lives in the gap between who you know yourself to be and how you fear you appeared, and uses the replay as an endless courtroom in which to try and retry, a case that can never quite be closed. Shame is the engine of the loop in a way that most analyses of rumination miss. Because shame doesn't just make you feel bad about what happened, it makes you feel that you were the problem. Not that you made a mistake in the conversation, but that something more fundamental about you was on display and found wanting. And that belief, that the conversation exposed something insufficient at the core of who you are, cannot be resolved by understanding the conversation better. It can only be resolved by addressing the belief itself, by examining where it came from, how it was formed, and whether it has ever actually been true. For most people who live inside this kind of loop, the shame is old. It didn't begin with this conversation, or the last one, or the one before that. It began much earlier, in moments usually in childhood or adolescence where being exactly who you were produced a response that told you, clearly or subtly, that who you were was too much or not enough. or fundamentally difficult to be around. Those moments don't disappear. They settle into the foundation of how you interpret yourself in relation to others. And every conversation that carries a similar emotional signature, every exchange where you felt too exposed, too misread, too much or too little, reactivates them. The replay in this context is not just trying to fix what happened, it is trying to fix the original verdict. It is trying to go back, through the medium of this specific conversation, to the place where the shame was first handed to you. And finally, this time, say the right thing. Arrive in the right way. Be received without the familiar contraction that happens when you sense that who you are is about to be too much for the space you're in. The loop keeps running because that moment of correction keeps feeling just one more replay away, and it will keep feeling that way until the work moves from the conversation to the place where the shame was first born. The attachment pattern. You don't know you're running. Every conversation exists inside a relationship, and every relationship you've ever had has taught your nervous system something about what to expect when you are emotionally present with another person, whether to expect safety or risk, whether to expect to be met or to be misunderstood, whether closeness is something that reliably expands the sense of yourself or something that reliably requires you to make yourself smaller in order to maintain it. These expectations don't announce themselves. They operate in the background of every exchange, shaping what you hear, what you miss, what you flag as significant, and what you carry away when the conversation is over. In attachment psychology, these background expectations are called working models. They are the internal blueprints your nervous system built across years of experience for how closeness works. How much of yourself is safe to bring? How much vulnerability is likely to be met with care versus withdrawal? Whether the people you need most can be trusted to stay present when you show them something real. Most people never examine these blueprints directly. They simply live inside them, mistaking the blueprint for reality, assuming that the relational patterns they keep encountering are facts about the world rather than predictions generated by an internal model that was built under very specific conditions long ago, by a nervous system that was doing its best to survive. The conversations that get replayed are almost always the ones that confirmed the blueprint. Not necessarily in obvious ways. Sometimes it's the conversation where someone did something unexpectedly kind, and you found yourself immediately analyzing what it meant, why it happened, whether it was real, whether it would last. Because your blueprint says that closeness is temporary, or conditional, or requires something from you that you'll eventually be unable to sustain. And the kindness, rather than simply landing as kindness, becomes a data point that needs to be processed, contextualized, made safe by being understood. Sometimes the replay isn't about a wound. It's about the disorientation of not knowing how to receive something good. More often, though, the blueprint is being confirmed in the direction of distance, the conversation that didn't quite connect, the moment where you reached for closeness and found something cooler than you expected, the exchange that ended with you feeling slightly more alone than you did when it began. Your nervous system wasn't surprised by any of it. On some level, it expected exactly this, and the replay is its way of processing not just the disappointment of this specific exchange, but the accumulated weight of every time this pattern has appeared before. The loop carries history. It was never just about this conversation. Understanding your attachment pattern doesn't fix it immediately, but it does something important. It shifts the question from why did that conversation go wrong to what was I bringing into that conversation before it even started? It reveals that the emotional charge you carry into exchanges with the people who matter most to you is not simply a response to them. It is a response to every relationship that came before them, every experience of being present with another person and discovering what that presence cost you. And until that charge is examined at the source, it will continue to shape every conversation you have, in ways you can feel but cannot yet fully see. When the mind replays to protect, not to punish. By now you may be noticing something. Every mechanism we've traced, the emotional echo, the identity wound, the unmet hope, the shame, the attachment blueprint, all of them serve a function. None of them are malfunctions. None of them are evidence of a broken mind. They are all, in their own way, attempts by your psychology to protect something. to preserve something, to ensure that the most vulnerable parts of you are not exposed without some form of preparation, processing, or prior understanding. The loop is a protection mechanism. This is perhaps the single most important reframe in this entire video. Because as long as you experience the replay as something your mind is doing to you, you will continue to fight it. You will try to stop it, interrupt it, replace it, discipline it into silence. And it will resist, because it is not a malfunction to be corrected. It is a signal to be understood. It is your inner world saying, in the only language your nervous system knows how to use, something here is not finished. Something here is still open. Do not move on until you have looked at this directly. The protection it is offering is real, even when the method feels like suffering. Your mind replays the conversation where you felt exposed because it is trying to ensure that you understand what made you vulnerable there, so that the next time, you are not caught off guard. It replays the moment where connection failed because it is trying to map the exact coordinates of that failure, to make the territory of emotional risk legible and predictable. It replays the exchange where you felt shame because it is trying to build, retroactively, the self-understanding and self-defense that wasn't available in the moment. None of this is irrational. All of it is, in the deepest sense, an act of care from one part of you toward another. The problem is not the intention. The problem is the method. Replaying cannot complete the work it is trying to do. It can circle the wound indefinitely, but it cannot heal it. Because healing requires something that memory alone cannot provide. It requires presence with the actual feeling, not the story about the feeling. It requires bringing the part of you that was hurt or exposed or unseen into contact with something that can actually meet it, whether that is your own conscious compassion, or a relationship that has the depth and safety to hold it, or a therapeutic space designed precisely for this kind of processing. The loop is pointing toward that work. It has been pointing toward it, in every replay, for as long as you've been running it. The invitation is not to stop the loop by force. It is to follow it. To let the replay lead you for once not to the surface of the conversation but to the emotional center of what it touched. To ask, not what should I have said differently, but what did this activate that was already alive in me before this conversation began? That question leads somewhere different. It leads somewhere quieter, and more uncomfortable, and far more true. And it is the only direction in which the loop, if you follow it honestly enough, eventually comes to rest. The quiet truth about what you're actually searching for. You have been searching for something. You may not have named it that way. It may have felt like you were simply trying to understand a conversation, process a feeling, make sense of an exchange that left you unsettled. But underneath all of that, there has been a search, consistent, patient, relentless, for something that has been harder to find than it should be. You have been searching for the experience of being fully known, not understood in the surface sense, not agreed with or validated or told that your feelings make sense. Fully known, the way you would need to be known if you brought the most unedited, unguarded, unfiltered version of yourself into a room with another person and discovered that it was not too much, that it didn't need to be adjusted or explained or softened before it could be received, that you could exist completely without the quiet act of self-monitoring that has become so habitual you barely notice it anymore. That experience is what every replayed conversation was trying to reconstruct. Because in each of those exchanges, something was almost there. Some moment of real contact that flickered briefly before disappearing. Some glimpse of being seen that didn't quite hold. And the replay is your mind returning to that almost, turning it over, examining it from every angle, trying to find the version of events in which it became complete, in which the connection that was possible actually happened, in which you did not have to leave the conversation carrying the familiar weight of almost. Here is what I want you to hear, clearly, and without softening it. The conversations you replay cannot give you what you are looking for, not because you phrased them wrong or chose the wrong moment or were too much or too little in the way you showed up, but because what you are searching for is not located in any single conversation. It is located in the relationship you have with yourself, with the parts of yourself that have been waiting, for a very long time, for the same thing you keep hoping someone else will provide. the recognition, the reception, the quiet confirmation that who you are at the full depth of it is not a burden to be managed but a presence to be met. The loop will begin to slow when that recognition starts to come from within, not as a destination, not as a practice you complete and then have, but as a gradual shift, a small but fundamental change in the way you hold yourself in the moments when you feel most exposed. When you notice the familiar contraction, the reaching for self-analysis, the impulse to replay, and you turn toward it with something other than the urge to correct it. When you begin to treat the sensitivity, the depth, the precise and sometimes overwhelming way you experience the world, not as a flaw to be managed, but as the same quality that allows you to see things other people miss, feel things other people can't name, and understand dimensions of human experience that most of the world has not yet learned to access. You are not built wrong, you are built deep. And depth, in a world that mostly moves along the surface, can feel like a kind of exile. But it is also the only place from which anything truly true can be seen. The conversations you replay were never the point. They were always invitations, to go further in, to look more honestly, to find the place in yourself that the loop has been circling all along. You've been going in circles long enough. Now you know where the center is.